to talk about the Catholic Church, Catholic power coming out of the Vatican. And as you can tell, Scotland is about as north as you can get in relation to this, aside from Iceland and Scandinavia. It's the northern tip of Great Britain, which is an island off the coast of Western Europe. And in that, a pretty isolated place compared to the rest of mainland Europe. This is Scotland, which you're looking at right now. The Highlands, of course, up in the northwest. And why I'm circling this is to show that this is where most of the witch hunts actually occurred. They occurred in urban economic centers. It wasn't out in the woods somewhere. It was in the middle of town with educated people facilitating these accusations, these tortures, and eventually the burnings. So going back again to that human geography, that area is isolated, heavily influenced by the heavily influenced by the other cultures that it traded with. It didn't have this hardcore devotion to any one religion. It was pretty open, kind of like, I would even argue Great Falls, just kind of a more libertarian type place. Again, with the fogginess and the darkness, a lot of things were by candlelight. There was no electricity back then. Can y'all hear me? Is it? There was no electricity back then, and eyeglasses were not mainstream. In fact, reports of magical sightings plummeted once eyeglasses became mainstream. Most of the folks then were farmers and hunters and sheep herders and fishermen. Again, this was right as, and I'll weave this in as well, but this was right as the Enlightenment or the academia took off. So at the time, literacy was not common unless you were wealthy and you could afford some sort of tutor. And because of the Catholic influence at the time, again, you were probably Catholic and probably wealthy, and that's how you got to understand, got access to education. Scotland was Christianized by 800 AD, predominantly Catholic, but if you're familiar at all with Catholicism, they do have a penchant for mysticism, which worked well with the folk traditions of Scotland. So there was this sort of, well, yes, in some areas Catholics did do away with pagan religions. But there were some areas, particularly up in Scandinavia, northern, or even Great Britain and Scotland, where it did kind of flow to mix herbal medicines with your own Catholic beliefs, and that was tolerated. Now, the Protestant Reformation, which I'll get into, was significant because at the time everybody was united under the Catholic Church. Everything answered to the Catholic Pope. That's what everything, the power, the money, everything rallied around this Catholic flag. And then at the fall of Catholic Church or Protestant Reformation, it really shook things up. Suddenly there was no singular order anymore. It was just kings and their kingdoms trying to figure out who would then become the most powerful. Again, this emphasis on academia started to arrive from the mainland. The Enlightenment is taking off, and then later on would be the death of magic. And again, you have inner conflicts amongst the Scots, amongst the bloodlines, royalty, then you got friends in England across the way, you got the Vikings coming up north. Like, they're tough people with a lot of enemies all around. So, before we can get further, we need to talk about the influence of the Catholic Church at the time, because it was the most powerful force in Western Europe, hands down. Seated at the Vatican in Italy, not only was it the wealthiest power source in the world, but it was also the largest landowner. If you were not following the Catholic tradition, you could be excommunicated, you could be demonized, you could lose a lot if you were to speak out against the Catholic Church. Furthermore, the Bible was produced and written in Latin at the time. The first English Bible did not come until 1532. So really, the first 1,500 years of Christians' history, the Christians couldn't read their own Bible. You had to rely on your minister to tell you what it said, because he was the wealthy Catholic that had the funds to go to school to learn Latin. Furthermore, as I said, with being the richest, they got their way by being rich because they taxed the churches, they taxed the kingdoms, they taxed the dioceses. They had all sorts of financial things going on, which led to extreme corruption amongst leadership and bishops. Lots of people pocketing that money. You had noble landlords writing to one another, "My peasants keep uprising. I give them food and beer. Why are they still mad?" And them writing back, "Well, have you considered bringing a church on property? You can pick your own bishop." Well, it's a bishop. What's the guy that tells them what to do, what their morals are? Well, I like that. So you got that going on. And then finally, all the kings, Denmark, Germany, England, Scotland, everybody had to answer to the Pope. Furthermore, the Crusades were called by the Pope. They weren't called by any king, which is crazy to think now, that someone else somewhere else can then rise up armies for their own purposes. So, as the Protestant Reformation took off, it started in a couple different pockets. Protestant meaning protesting. They were protesting the church. They were looking for reform. It was not only the dominant belief system, but that was the social and government structure. That's how everything was aligned. The work week based on Holy Catholic days. It was all the way down to funerals and weddings. I mean, this was the way you did things. And when various leaders and various religious leaders pushed back on it, it created a power vacuum. So this led specifically in Scotland to what does it mean to be Protestant, who is in charge now, who gets to decide the social morale, the fiber of society. In Scotland, you had essentially two groups going on that were within the Christian faith. And two schools of thought. I don't want to say two groups, but two schools of thought. You had the Presbyterians or the Puritans, Calvinists, different groups all kind of falling under the same belief system, did not want the Catholic Church to come back, did not want the King of England to take over the Catholic Church and then put his own English spin on it. They wanted the individual churches at a local level to have their say on how their faith would look like, particularly because of the corruption and the money that we just mentioned earlier. Furthermore, the Episcopal, or the Anglican Church, was the centralized government. This Episcopal means that it is bishop-led, so very, very similar to Catholic. We'll talk about it in a second, but they also felt that the church and state should be one. They'll just pick up where the Catholics left off, but they'll keep it here in England, in Scotland. Very interested in having a godly state with everybody under one religion doing one thing. Again, I told you this Game of Thrones, here we go. We got some royal family drama. So this Protestant versus Catholic was not really so much about theology, but a power struggle. In fact, if you go and look at the Episcopalian Church now, or if you go and look at some of these worship services, there is a lot of Catholic things that they carried over. It wasn't that they threw out the Bible, they didn't throw out communion, it wasn't these larger things going on. It was really about who gets to say that their understanding and interpretation of faith wins out. You have King Henry VIII. He protested the Catholic Church. He wanted to divorce his wife. His wife would not give him a son, and he blamed her, wanted to divorce her, and the Pope said no. Divorce is not allowable, legal in the Catholic Church, and he said, this is dumb, this is my kingdom, this is my wife, I want to choose who I want to be with. And that's what really starts to shift on the English side. You also have Martin Luther in Germany, and a couple other folks in Denmark, and in France, and in Spain, having other similar arguments of like, no, we're not going to do this anymore. I want to lead my own people doing whatever I want, I'm the king. So he protests the Catholic Church, a couple things go on, more things, and eventually he forms the Anglican Church, or the Episcopal Church, however you want to word it. And again, the Catholic Church was married with the state, so he just took it right on, just swapped out the names, essentially. Swapped it from Catholic to Episcopal. His bloodline, later down about 2 generations later, she takes the English throne. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who some of you may be familiar with, she becomes Queen of Scotland, Queen of Scots. So you have two cousins of the same bloodline. These are not merged kingdoms, and they immediately have insecurities of one another of who's going to take over the other one. Mary, Queen of Scots, gives birth to James VI. He is coronated as a baby real quick. Oh no, I'm worried I'm going to lose power. Let's get my son coronated real quick. And then he'll officially take over at the age of 12, which I cannot imagine answering to a 12-year-old. King James becomes, at the age of 12, as he becomes officially King James, that also means he is also head of the church in Scotland. In Scotland, they called their church system the Kirk. So if you see Kirk throughout here, that's what is their word, Kirk. This is the same King James I of England. He was the writer and authorizer of the King James Version of the Bible. So if you're familiar with the King James Version, it's this guy. And then as he later on would take over England and then unite them, he leaves and creates a power vacuum, which also adds to the political instability. Furthermore, King James, as a young man, watches his cousin Queen Elizabeth behead his mom. So he's got some serious anger going on towards the English throne. Furthermore, Mary, Queen of Scots, her claim to the throne was always being questioned and jeopardized. She was always leaving and hiding out and coming back. Lots of infighting, and he just really did not have a good relationship with his mother. And now someone else beheaded him. He's got some female anger going on. Reputably paranoid. Many documents will confirm it. When you are that close to power at such a young age, when you see all that, you're going to breed that kind of personality. Again, we had so many threats just in Europe going on, and then within the powers, and just constantly paranoid that he was going to lose power. He, again, head of church and state, and how he led. You, of course, have your royal council and that hierarchy, but then you have all your bishops that are answering to you too. His wife, or his soon-to-be wife, was Queen Anne of Denmark, and I didn't put this up there, but he sends ships on 3 different trips to Denmark to go and retrieve his beloved, and all 3 times he sends for her, these ships hit storms, real bad storms. He is convinced that it's because of witchcraft, somehow. Furthermore, when he finally does retrieve his wife and he gets back to Scotland, he observes the New Brunswick witchcraft trials, which actually started at the political level, at the elite level, and he watches how calling another royal a witch or a wizard or some sort of devil-possessed person could do a lot of damage and could probably be an asset for him. So a couple different things. He feels personally affected by the witches. He sees how blaming one another for being a witch or a magical person could cause them great harm. Maybe he could do that for his own influence. Furthermore, he was very interested in this godly state, that if everyone could just behave and be Anglican and Episcopal, follow the ways without question, we get on pretty good. He goes on to write the Demonology in 1603. This was his first personal, from the desk of the king. This was his argument that witches are real and needed to be rounded up and killed and extinguished for the safety of the kingdom. He also starts to ban women in groups because of this. It triggers a full-scale paranoia. Women, it was very common at the time to needle together, to sew together, to do different tasks around the village together, and he bans that. He then goes on to say, by the way, witches, it's not these women, it's that they're possessed by the devil. They're vehicles, they're of the devil, they're agents of the devil. With that, he creates 1606, the King James Version of the Bible I just mentioned. He issues it to all schools and all villages at the time in an attempt to squash out Gaelic culture and promote literacy while making the Bible the singular form of education at the time. Furthermore, I forgot to add this on here, but just to throw it all in there, he bans homosexuality. So, so witches, what are we talking about? Who were they? What's going on? So the Witchcraft Act of 1535, there was no clear definition of witch. There's not a singular, if you go in that document, the strongest argument to getting rid of witches was that were they weird? Were they opinionated? Were they strange women? Nothing about any of what they did, nothing of any real evidence or motivations and behaviors, just non-conformist, non-ladylike. What are they doing not conforming to the Episcopal Church or Anglican Church? Most of the women that were reported, by the way, well, no. Most of the women that were accused of witchcraft, again, people weren't really educated or literate back at the time. There was no such thing as public schools the way that we have now. So they're poor, illiterate. Many of them were over the age of 50. Perhaps they were widowed. Perhaps they didn't marry, which would have been rare for that time. Maybe their kids had left the house, but most of them were just kind of older ladies away from town, being postmenopausal and wanting to be left alone. Again, one of the things that they looked for in witches was, did they have spirit? Did they have opinions? Would they get in arguments with people? These were against femininity, especially with... I feel like there's some Montana women in here like, we war! But it was really just like, if you were not an effeminate, quiet woman, you were subject to questioning. Perhaps you had been possessed by the devil. What could perhaps, what could possibly have motivated you to speak out or have any sort of attitude? I didn't mention this early. In addition to the fall of the Catholic Church was also that rise of academia that I mentioned, colleges and universities. A massive hit to the Catholic Church was in 1532. Let's get those two switched. When Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, came out and said, no, the Earth revolves around the sun. The sun is part of one solar system, or part of a solar system that's part of a galaxy, that's part of a universe. We're just like a speck, guys. And the Catholic Church didn't like that. The Catholic Church had forever told its people that the humans on Earth were the center of the universe, and that the Church was the center of Earth, and that God was at the center of the Church, and that's why you should give them money. But it really was. What it did, it triggered two different things. You saw, three technically, but on one hand, you saw the doubling down of people being like, no, academia and science and all this stuff, that is sinful. It goes against us. That's the devil's work. They're trying to lead you astray. We must stay closer to our Bible and closer to our religion. Then you had folks that left the church entirely because for the first time, the church was wrong in a public way. And that really upset the followers. And then you had some people in the middle that kind of started to just question, but maybe they didn't leave. They didn't want to jeopardize their social standing. Again, the church was the way of life back then, and to leave it was kind of lonely. So, why? Why were they hunted? So again, we have King James up at the top. He's paranoid. He thinks witches are out to come for his power. They're going to take away his power somehow. That's at the executive level. But down here at the commoner level, there were some seriously bad weather years, poor farming conditions. We Montanans are not strangers to that. And the second wave of the bubonic plague. So you had an epidemic, you had famine, you had economic hardship. People were really stressed. They're looking for a savior. They're looking for hope. They're looking for answers. They're looking for order. And they're looking for someone to blame. You had competing religious pluralism. So what that means is now that there wasn't this forced mandated Christian Catholic Church to comply with, all these different denominations and all their individual churches trying to recruit people. Come join us, come join. And like, why would you stand out? Whether it's because you're an extreme faction or you just have other things to offer, you start to see this competition. Now, I mentioned earlier with the Catholic mysticism and witches meaning, I mean, we know about herbal medicine and spells and events happening within culture. I mean, like the Celts, for one, are very influential on insofar as having a lot of seasonal celebrations, the equinox, the solstice, Stonehenge. So there was already a belief in this sort of mysticism that was now part of their community. You could be a healer, you could be a clairvoyant. That was received. That became distorted during this time. They went back and changed it. No longer is it someone to be embraced. We support these healers and seers of society. Now it doesn't come from them. It's not goodly. It's the devil. You had the strict rules of Calvinism and predestination. Again, going back to what it means to be a Christian lady. And also, Calvinists believed in this predestination. Either you were already going, like God planned for you to be saved in your life, or you weren't. Maybe God planned for you to be wealthy, but you were supposed to be poor. But everything that happens in your life is because it's already been decided before you were born. We do notice that in the 200 years that this is going on, every time that the Presbyterians and Calvinists clashed with the king and the power at the top, that more women were hunted. So as it got more and more stressful between the two powers that be, other people suffered. And then there were all sorts of accusations of infertility, sexual dysfunction, injury, financial hardship. Again, Scotland was having a hard time. Heavy famine, the second wave of the bubonic plague, healthcare was not what it is today, and suddenly it was real convenient that the state was now talking about that there's some evil afoot. I also want to present that the Presbyterians and the Calvinists also believed in witchcraft and doing away with witches. So you had the state that was out to get witches, and you had the local people that were out to get them. And so there wasn't like a good guys and bad guys in this thing. Furthermore, all of this was not carried out in the woods, out. These weren't like just small town things happening. These were carried out by lawyers, clergy, judges, people that were extremely educated, had power, had influence. Again, this clash of all these moralities and these worldviews, this competition of the free market of believers, come join us, come join us. And even claiming that your church was a notable witch hunting church was a form of marketing. We're out here to rid evil, come join us. And then, much like we even saw back in Nazi Germany, if a church or the power structure is going one way, everything else is going to go that way, and you have to look or speak or believe in certain things to hold a job, to hold titles, fall in line. And again, that extremism, these different groups forming out, and who will be most righteous and most loyal to the king. And no legal definition of witchcraft, which is the most frustrating bit of it all. It was so vague and up to interpretation, and that is why so many women were killed. It was an existing belief that witches and folk magic was acceptable, but this was thwarted. They were now fouled, satanic vehicles of dark magic. It is worth noting that throughout all this, the king and his royal court did still see folk healers. They just requested that they show there's some proof of Christianity before going about it. So, because in their eyes, to be Christian not only pledged your faith to Jesus and God, and didn't go that theory, but it also was you pledging loyalty to the king. So they were one and the same. If you question Christianity, you were questioning the king. This is what scripture they used this was their rally cry. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This was highly regurgitated and And it's what made them feel like what they were doing was sanctified, it was holy, it was righteous, this was all permissible because of this line. The witch hunters were celebrated as heroes. I mean, if you came back and said you killed 20 women, 20 witches, you got a parade, you got paid money, you got taken out for drinks, which of course created a following. You had all sorts of copycats who would also go out, start killing witches on their own, start accusing witches, doing whatever. It just, much like, I mean, yeah, this whole sort of emphasis on these righteous witch hunters that are out here doing the Lord's work, including Matthew Hopkins. Now, he is an Englishman. We're focusing on Scotland, but he's worth mentioning. And he just went out and killed something like 300 women. It was very lucrative. That lends itself to fraud. It was fraudulent. These women, scholars claim that 2% of those women that were killed had any sort of reputation for being killed. So these really just like only 2% of the women they killed, the community thought, oh, maybe they are a healer, seer, or whatever, but the rest of them were just women. It was something like almost like 4% of their population they killed, which I did look up on the United Nations to see what number of people constitutes a genocide, and there's no number, which I thought was interesting. But they killed about 4% of their population in all of this. In that book, he argues, or in order to write that book, he was a German lawyer who accused a woman of witchcraft. He failed in the court, she got off, and he got mad and said, you know what, now that I know the process, this is what I would do. Here's the questions, here's the leading questions I would do, here's the arguments I would make, and truly wrote the manual for witch hunting that got to be widely mass-produced and sent over and was used by the Scottish lawyers, clergy, judges, again, academic folks. He did end it with that it's not enough for them to be sent to the guillotine or for them to be hung, with the noose, which was very common at the time. No, these people needed to be burned, tortured. That this was the evil of all evil, and this should be the response. We have to burn and purge the earth of this evil. Some of the questions that he wrote for the interrogations were questions about how are you able to control cattle? How are you able to control the weather? What was it like to have intercourse with the devil? And tell me about it. Can you, how is it that you are flying in the middle of the night and transporting to do all these magical tasks? I mean, the questions were crazy to begin with, but this is what he argues. This is what these women were doing. Now the interrogations, there's a major, like I said, a major focus on intercourse with the devil. Like it was almost primarily about intercourse with the devil. Even in that book, it's got like 2 or 3 sections, and there's like 1/3 or even 1/3 and half of the second third is just all focused on the devil's genitalia, or sleeping with ghosts, or how are you affecting, human men's sex drive. I mean, it was like very much obsessed with these women. These women had been possessed by the devil, and then were going around harming the men that were here, the commoners. There was questions about the devil's pact. What were you doing, out at moonlight? Why are you by the water by yourself? How were you affecting your neighbor's fertility? Birthing, spells, animals. Like it was madness. They were very interested in questioning and wondering, like, have you ever renounced Christianity? How are you a Christian by fraud? Are you just a devil walking amongst us? A very high pressure in the involvement and naming of others. That was a big part of it too. They wanted, from each woman that they accused, they were trying to get at least 4 or 5 more women's names out of them. It is worth noting that 85% of the people that were accused of witchcraft, 15% were male. Scholars believe those men were probably accused because of homosexuality. But those men were not asked any of these questions. And then finally, when the women were to be put up on the stake and burned, do you have any last words? And with their final breath, would maintain their innocence. And you could say, well, yeah, they didn't want to burn. It is their last breath, and if they were real witches, wouldn't you think they would call upon their devil to save them? So legal methods of torture. They were jailed without bail for 6 to 9 months. Again, these women were signing confessions. They're illiterate. They're signing legal confessions. They're in jail, signing jail documents, having no idea what they're signing. Very common that these men would keep them awake 3, 4, 5 days at a time. I mean, to the point of like true bodily failure. And then in those sleep deprivations and in those hallucinations that they would get with that lack of sleep is when they would start to ask questions about the devil and flying. And of course, if you've been awake for 3 days, 4 days, you're going to start answering questions real weird. You're going to start hallucinating it. And so they were signing these legal confessions based on their hallucinations. Again, this is all legal, and how we know about it is because it was all legal. This was all part of to them, torture was another day in the jail for them. It was like, oh yes, we kept her awake for 3 days, and she's having bodily shakes, she hasn't eaten, and she has admitted to flying. We'll keep it. Starved and shaven, they were defeminized, dewomanized, dehumanized. There was the use of bondage and torture tools. Physical and sexual assault were legal, or at least not criminalized in Scotland. It wasn't uncommon for an average woman back in the day in her lifetime to be sexually assaulted 3, 4, 5 times in her life, just grabbed in the middle of the street or wrong place, wrong time. That's why we do see a lot of whether you're marrying for love or not, there's marriage for protection as well. Much of this torture, again, was sexual in nature. Again, these would be women brought into a jail cell, and then with male jailers that would keep them up for days at a time for any means possible, by any means possible, including their own sexual desires. Pricking was also a major tell. They would take the women, an individual woman, putting her into a room, lock her up by her wrists and ankles, stretch her on a table, and they would poke with a needle throughout her body until she didn't bleed. So maybe if you poke there and you bled, but maybe like on the back of the thigh or fattier parts that aren't so much going to bleed or be as sensitive, they would look at that as like, she can't even feel a needle. She's not even bleeding. She must be a witch. It was even better if it was a mole or some kind of blemish. Like, that is the devil's mark. See that freckle on the back of her thigh? That's her tell. That's her giveaway. John Kincaid was a major pricker. Again, kind of like Matthew Hopkins. He made a lot of money and had a lot of notoriety from running around pricking women and confirming that these were witches. It later came out that he was a fraud. Not only did he, but he did in his own confession. He said, or something almost like 270 women. I just decided that they were witches, or I, was dishonest about their pricking. Here are the legal methods of torture. We'll go counterclockwise. So this black and white larger piece, larger picture on the right, she's wearing a headpiece. She's got a metal tongue piece so that she can't speak. And if they were feeling particularly ruthless, and you see in the bottom right-hand corner, they would put a spiked ball at the end of the tongue piece. So if she tried to do anything, she just bloodied up her tongue, her cheeks, everything about her mouth. You also see other forms of hiding eyes and face and just dehumanizing. You see the stretching tool. Put their prisoner up on this tool, wind it up, and it pull and pull and pull until you were separated at a ligament level. muscles and tendons. Here's another woman wearing another sort of headpiece that was bladed or had some sort of instrument to prevent her from opening her mouth. And then finally, this was for insertion of the female genitalia. So, nothing good. All in the name of a godly society. You have women in this left-hand corner all being burned together. Sometimes they were burned all at once. Sometimes it was individual cases. This whole thing went for 200 years. You would see, I think there was one case where there were 600 women at once. But for the most part, it was just everybody had 10 to 15 cases going on at the same time. They would beg for forgiveness or beg for their innocence or beg for release, and then of course get beaten for speaking back to the king. This is, on the top right, is someone pushing a woman into the fire. And then on the bottom right is a woman being hung from, she's in a chair, she's being lowered into the river, and if she drowns, she's not a witch. But if she survives, she's a witch. Once you do the logic. So, real stories. We have Isabel Grierson. She's a folk healer. She lived out of town. She was accused of bewitching the local feral cats. That's what they thought made her a witch. To back up her claim, the bubonic plague did move into that community, that range, and what scholars now believe is that because she had cats and cats eat mice and she lived away from the population, she did all right. But that's not what the townspeople thought. Agnes Sampson, elderly midwife, again, these midwives and witches were welcome at pregnancies and as midwives. But now, if anything went wrong, it was because it was those women to blame. So a lot of accusations of, I was delivering my baby and this woman set a curse on me in the middle of childbirth and that's why my baby died. There was Ellen Gray. She was friend to battered wife of Thomas Riddell, accused of fatally poisoning Mr. Riddell's manhood. How the story goes. Excuse me. So the story goes that Thomas Riddell's wife was commonly seen with Ellen Gray. They were friends. They'd go out and do friend things. And Thomas Riddell was probably insecure that his wife told her friend that, hey, he's not so nice to me at home. And then later on, Thomas Riddell, who not only did he beat his wife, but was also open to inviting other women into their relationship. She wasn't allowed to have other men, but he could cheat on his wife. And so really, when we talk about Mr. Riddell's manhood being poisoned, we're talking about an STD that he brought about on himself and now blamed Ellen Gray for. Katie Liddell is a very important story. She was accused and tortured, but for reasons we can only guess, her father maybe, she somehow had access to reading and writing education, and because of that, she was able to write for a lawyer from the jail cell and then be set free. So, and then she turned around and was like, guys, this is real. Like, she became an advocate trying to help people out as well. Throughout all of this, while there was, all of this was going on, there were people that doubted it or didn't like it or had other issues. So they were slowly poking holes, but at the same time, it was a mania. It was a whole widespread mania. But it is worth noting that there were people trying to speak up. Marion Walker, again, leading into poking holes into things. Marion Walker was a defender of women in Glasgow. She takes on Margaret Aiken. Margaret Aiken was a woman who was accused of witchcraft, and in order to save her skin, she said, no, you're right, I am a witch, but I'll work with you. I'll work with the state. I'll be on your side, and I'll locate the witches using my own powers. I can identify a witch just by looking at her in the eyes. And this was believed. I mean, King James got excited. He thought he now had a super weapon on his side. He was like, oh, now we've got one of the witches. We've converted them. Like, they're going to do our bidding. And Marian was having none of this. So one day when Margaret accused a bunch of women of witchcraft, she came back the next day, changed all those women's clothes, changed their order, and then said, now look at them in the eye. And the results were not the same. She said, well, you know what? You can't look them in the eye. They were in different clothes, they're in a different order. Like, how come yesterday some were witches and now today they're not? Logic's not holding up. And it was a very public event. And again, people were poking holes at the time. There were whispers, but this was like a big instance of like, these witch hunters aren't true. They're not valid. Furthermore, it started to shake things up. Other communities were starting to have other situations where the truth was coming out. There were letters and documents going on between villages and authorities and different people being like, I think we may have killed some innocent people, or are we sure that our methodologies of identifying witches are 100% true? And I'm doubtful. I don't think that every single woman we've killed is a witch. And Marian takes that, finds that document somehow, and then circulates it. So, go Marian. Now, the end of the hunts the Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1735. This was in the rise of academia. Why academia was so important to the beginning and the end of the story was because those wealthy Catholic men were in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen. They would go and study abroad in mainland Europe. And at the time, everybody kind of believed in witches, and that's where they would share stories and hype each other up, and then they went back to their homelands and you'll never believe how awful these witches are in Germany. Like, we got to get them while they're here. And but then as academia increased and more scientific studies published, more intellect, reading, reason, that's also what killed the witch hunts. So weirdly enough, academia prompted the witch hunts and then also ended them. There was also the loss of belief in the supernatural and the mystical. Lots of scientific advancements were made in this time, and suddenly being a magical witch didn't really hold its power because they started to question, like, well, how did she fly then? Because, those kinds of questions of like, we know that humans can't fly because of, and being able to argue that logically shut down a lot of the mystic, magical, supernatural. In fact, even Ben Franklin wrote an article that, I can't remember, it's like 1812, but it's outside of our window, where he was basically like, if you're still trying to go after witches or run on the base, get into, speak politically or powerfully about witches and demonize these women, like, you're archaic, you're dumb, like you clearly are not educated. And so it became a matter of, are you educated? And that sort of status that has come from enlightenment and academia. So, how did that impact our culture? The same people that fled Scotland for America were the same people that carried over their witchcraft beliefs and carried out the Salem witch trials. So they're all connected. The reason why the Salem witch trials were so much shorter than the Scottish witch hunts was because, again, academia had really taken off. So when they landed in America, and they're like, there's witches here too? That was quickly shut down within a matter of decades. And that was something that was still like small and localized and coming from maybe a group that was not exposed to education. The collection of torture artifacts in the 19th and 20th centuries, at first it was kind of something people really didn't talk about, and then it renewed interest, which is different explorations and travels, and torture artifacts became collectibles. We have, in the 1960s, we have the TV show Bewitched, where it's okay to be a witch, as long as you're an obedient housewife. Now it's the man possessing them, right? And then also, I'm sorry, I think it's the laptop. And then Harry Potter, which was, again, a little bit later, just more stuff on witches that came out, Wizard of Oz and whatnot. But Harry Potter also really shook up things and renewed interest because it was targeted for kids. So you had a whole generation that was interested in witches and witchcraft from the Harry Potter novels in connection with the rising internet. So now you had a bunch of 12-year-olds Googling witchcraft spells. Furthermore, this sexualization, it was, and I still, like, it really is hard to swallow or digest, like this shaming and these accusations and these torture of these women that were powerful, or not even necessarily powerful, these women that talked back or questioned society or didn't want to conform and be ladylike because they were possessed by the devil, and that's what they needed to go into jail for. And then while they were in jail, were most likely sexually assaulted repeatedly over a 6 to 9 month period. And so it's this question of like, well, if these women are so like foul and touched by the devil, why are you sexually assaulting them? Like, aren't you now getting involved with this devil somehow? Like, we know some folks will argue that the green face is the green face because they've lived in the woods and they're old and haggardly. And a lot of scholars come back and say, actually, that green face and artwork comes about in Macbeth with William Shakespeare. And probably because they were beaten and starved for as long as they were, and they looked awful. And then we have Stevie Nicks. Stevie Nicks' story is when she was young, early in her career, she saw Jimi Hendrix. She opened for Jimi Hendrix. She noticed that Jimi Hendrix had a different persona on stage than he did backstage, and she thought, wow, this is what it takes to be successful. I've got to come up with an on-stage persona. Ooh, I'll do this like witchy thing. So Stevie Nicks throughout her career is known for being this witchy person, but it got so significant at the height of her career she had to release a statement saying, I'm not a witch, please quit sending me dead bunny feet. I'm not a witch, this is just fun and entertainment, it's a persona for the fans. Stop it. Furthermore, the Scottish Prime Minister Nicola Sturgeon back in 2022 issued a formal apology. The rise of the internet played a role in more and more people getting involved in witch history. Furthermore, the University of Edinburgh and even Harvard University near Boston, near the Salem witch trials, they also legitimized it by having courses on Scottish witch hunts and Scottish history and women's. So we do start to see institutional legitimacy and apologies for the fate of the women. Some takeaways. This scapegoating during political duress, this sense of leadership distrust, these civil conflicts, everyone's at each other's throats, and anyone who is not in the middle of this is being, in this case, accused of torture, but is being left to suffer. This religious pluralism, it shakes up the status quo. Again, the Catholic Church or even a denomination at large no longer gets to say what it means to be Christian or what it means to be godly or what it means to be loyal to the state. Now you have all these different denominations coming up and shaking up control, really. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, in all of this at this time, you have the banning of homosexuality, the killing of women, and then you have the squashing of Gaelic culture through the King James Version Bible. Again, this era of human history was carried out by folks in leadership. This wasn't just people out in the boonies. This was real leaders, real people with authority and status and influence that were using the law and using the Bible and their own personal vendettas to commit atrocities to women. And finally, they didn't burn witches, they burned women. My sources, real quick, this is Ashes and Stone. I can also pass this out. This book is written by an American who went to Scotland to go follow, she actually toured and went on any known site she went and visited, and she goes and talks about the individual stories of the site she visited. You can take a picture if you'd like. And then, of course, all the other stuff that I had to use to support my case. Thank you.
Can you go back a couple slides to your political? That one. I just am astounded how we've learned nothing. That if you substitute Gaelic for immigrant, that's America right now.
I can't speak on modern politics. I can't promise to Sarah.
I'm just thinking that what it means today, that nothing's changed. It's human nature.
Human nature, and yeah, whether history repeats itself or if humans are just that predictable. But yeah.
It's a huge history.
Yes, Gil.
I'm horrified at what you said about King James. Why are we all still reading the King James version
Yeah, so that book is, it is used in some denominations. It could be just like a tie to tradition. I mean, that book, it wasn't just the Scottish witch hunts, it was used in the genocide of Native Americans and slavery. So that's just one instance of it being used. There are now a plethora of different Bibles that denominations and churches use. But yeah, it's a good question. It does make you think about a political leader putting his name on a Bible.
I can give you an answer to that. Originally, all the English people were reading a Bible that came out of Switzerland, and it described the king as a despot and used that word specifically. And King James disliked that.
Is there anything that I missed, or any clarifying questions or anything? I know.
What about Scotland? Do you think it was right for this to happen? If you were to guess.
Mainly because of England, and the King of England, how powerful it was. They're away from everybody else. They're not really being held accountable. There's not really media coming out, or you could have travelers in Germany and Spain. I don't want to say accountability, but there's a lot of things that when you're an island or isolated, you can get away with because no one's knows.
So I'm trying to think, are we talking like 4, 5 generations of time? I mean, 200 years back then? That just blows my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just destroying families and lineages, the whole 9 yards.
Oh yeah.
So just the cultural trauma.
Yeah, and then what it would do to, the silencing if you didn't want to be a part of it, the distrust. I mean, it wasn't not specifically this, but the upheaval in Scotland was a lot of why folks came to America. And then some of them came to America and kept bringing it.
So another follow-up question. Did you see anything about rates? I mean, was like a higher rate of burning, which is early on, like the whole silence? Like, if my mom and my aunt all got burned, I'm more likely to STFU.
Right.
Because I've learned, so maybe there wouldn't be as many women exemplifying witchy behavior near the end, or is it just, we didn't have to?
For sure, the 16th, so if it's through the 1500s through the 1700s, and this ended in 1735, really, the 1600s were the prime part. And again, not only because now people are hiding and knowing what to say, but academia at the time was different. So academia evolved in 200 years, and it took people a little bit to catch up.
In America, it seems like we hear about the Salem witch trials, but we don't, I never really heard of this extensively. In other countries, is this more well known?
I'm sure in Europe it's a bit more well known. The rise of the internet played a role in it too. The legitimacy of Harvard and University of Edinburgh. It shocking as I was doing the research that there is still witch hunting going on in third world countries, just like this. So, hunting the devilish or the mystic is still ongoing, particularly with women. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned several times that there was, you mentioned that there was no legal definition for a witch or witchcraft, and we're talking about mid-1500s.
Yeah.
Do you, I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think there was any objectivity in the legal system for other topics? Or this was simply subjective in this topic, but over here it was really objective?
That's a good question. I can't really answer that because I don't know more about Scottish law, but I would assume that if they are also targeting Gaelic culture, that they probably had some sort of arbitrary, what was punishable enough, you know, what sort of Gaelic thing were you doing, kind of thing.
That we don't know.
Right, right, so. Oh, yes.
I just have to ask, other countries that weren't exactly where what you were just talking, like Chinese and stuff like that, did they have the same things that our people were doing that? Like,
Good. I mean, there are stories of history of women being subject for all sorts of reasons. This was really more like the dark edge of Christianity and the church of state and that sort of mixture. Of course, other countries do align their religion with their state. And so we do see women torture or women having unfair prison sentences or dehumanizing sort of punishments. But in this case, this was also kind of wrapped up in if we don't treat these women this way, we are allowing witches to live, and that makes us guilty. That makes us sinful. So we have to do away with sin.
I can't help thinking about anything like this, anything at all, human beings, without looking at more of the economic, political context. How is their advantage threatened by these women? And it's why women? I just don't understand, because there's male authority, paranoia, male authority because they own the land, they have the education and so on, church authority, then they have all these hard times. It seems like the least threatening individuals would be single women without any authority, without any property.
Yeah.
Why would they be, that's the hardest thing to be grasped.
And some of them did have power and authority. Some of them had land, and they'd end up in a nunnery to protect or hold them.
That and yes, like there were women that had power and authority, that had property, or made significant income off their land to have some sort of affluence.
That would be ancient.
But how do I want to say this? It was far easier for men to conform and then have community and be someone in this society versus women who couldn't hold status and power. So even if you were a man of the same age or same kind of situation going on, it was totally fine if you argued or had some issue with the politics. But if a woman did, that was unchristian. That wasn't okay. So there's also just the dynamics of the gender roles playing out as well. But I mean, yeah, most of these women were over the age of 50. Like they didn't. These weren't like women that were out here like breeding some sort of army and they were going to take over. I mean, they were beyond their birthing days and wanting to be left alone. So I can tell someone asking questions, but yeah. So again, I think. Men of the same status had an easier time to belong in that society, and then if a woman didn't, then she just stuck out that much more.
Why do you suppose the men were a threat to one another when it came to seeking that advantage? If they had scarcity and all the problems, why do you suppose the men were a threat to one another when they were seeking that advantage and they were insecure? They had more weaponry to
trying to follow the statement. So the question is why, so because men could fight back or they could be a threat,
They could try to dominate one another. They could compete for resource that was scarce, express political authority, dominate one another. Why would, that's, you know what I mean?
yeah.
It would make more sense they would try to eliminate the greater threat to their own net advantage, not somebody's powerless to do anything.
Well, and that's also like, witchcraft wasn't the only crime. You could jail or do other things to men. There is this sort of like wrapped around spiritual devilness that is associated with the women. That was a big part. They weren't accusing threatening men of sleeping with the devil. They were accusing these weak and vulnerable women of sleeping with the devil and now getting power and having to rise from the bottom.
So, I know you mentioned like, Mary Queen of Scots and everything, so and I might be a little bit wrong on my timelines here, but was there like the War of Roses and all that going on at the same time as these witch hunts?
It was before.
It was before.
I did have a timeline, but I hid it for the sake of time.
I just wanted to know what else was going on.
Yeah. Let's see if I can present this if it'll let me. No, it won't. But yeah, they have, I can't because I'm on Sarah's. But this one is not so good. Maybe go to the 1600s. Yeah, this is where a lot of other English and international politics start to play out. You have civil wars, the establishment of Nova Scotia, the Presbyterians fleeing, Oliver Cromwell, and then finally after the Salem witch trials. But yeah, I mean, this whole 1600s was rife with all sorts of civil and political issues. Let's see what else happened. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
How do witches tie into Halloween? Is there anything in Scotland similar to Halloween within witches?
So, in the witches that we're talking about, not necessarily, but if you are talking about earthly healers, if you're talking about Wicca or pagan religions that did use herbal medicines, you know, the more, like I said, pagan or folk traditions, they did have events associated with the different seasons. So you do see All Hallows Eve and having women be the spiritualists that would lead to a spiritual ceremony. So, and then also marketing.
Does Scotland have anything like Halloween?
I don't think so. I don't.
Did they do Halloween?
Yeah. Probably not the same way we do. But thank you. Great question.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming out tonight. I hope that we all learned something this evening. There was a plethora of information, so thank you. And again, the host here at the Great Falls Public Library, we're always here trying to connect people and knowledge, trying to make sure that you have the resources and information that you need out in the world, so that we don't do witch hunts anymore and other things. But we also always have programming going on. So whether it be Armchair Traveler, which is a monthly series that we started up again, or it be author talks, there's always something going on for everywhere from a newborn baby to an adult. So please come on out and join us for other future programming. There's more snacks and popcorn in the back, there's more water, and all of our information is back there. And then Leigh will be over here selling her G-Funk goodies. So thank you again for coming out.